I ignored Henry's third call while James poured more wine into my glass. The rooftop bar shook with music and expensive laughter. Someone from finance had received a promotion, and every person around the table suddenly acted as if they had always believed he deserved it. Cold wind moved across the open terrace while London glowed below us in blurred gold lights. My phone lit up again beside my elbow. Henry. James noticed the screen before I turned it over. "You're popular tonight," he said with a grin. I smiled automatically, though irritation had already started crawling beneath my skin. Henry knew I was out with coworkers. He also knew these dinners mattered at the company. Promotions were not only about performance there. They were about visibility, about staying present long enough for important people to remember your face. And at least that was what I kept telling myself. James leaned closer so I could hear him over the music. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and whiskey. "You should come to Amsterdam with us next month," he said. "You work harder than anyone in that office." People like James knew exactly how to make ambition sound seductive. Around him, exhaustion felt glamorous instead of lonely. A year earlier, I probably would have found him unbearable. Now I liked how effortless he made everything feel. I took another sip of wine while pretending not to think about Henry sitting alone at home. That had become easier recently. Not because I stopped caring completely, but because caring started feeling inconvenient beside the life I was building for myself. The strange thing was that James did not actually know me. He knew the polished version of me. The woman who stayed calm during impossible meetings and answered emails before sunrise. He knew how to compliment my presentations in ways that sounded professional enough to avoid judgment, but personal enough to stay in my head afterward. Henry knew the rest. He knew I could not sleep properly before presentations even after years at the company. He knew thunderstorms made me anxious because my mother used to leave the house during fights and disappear for hours whenever it rained heavily. He knew I secretly liked burnt toast because my grandfather made breakfast that way when I was a child. For some reason, those kinds of things had stopped feeling important to me. By the time I finally left the bar, it was nearly midnight. Rain covered the streets outside, turning traffic lights into long smears of color across the pavement. My heels hurt! My head hurt! Somewhere near the station entrance, my phone buzzed again inside my coat pocket. This time it was only a message. "Dinner's in the fridge. Hope you got home safe." That was it. No guilt, no argument, no passive-aggressive comment waiting underneath the words. For reasons I still hate admitting, his kindness irritated me. More than anger would have. I wish I could explain exactly when my marriage started feeling heavy, but nothing dramatic happened first. No affair, no screaming fight. Most relationships probably do not collapse from one terrible moment. They weaken quietly through small choices people stop noticing. Ignored dinners, half-listened conversations, the habit of reaching for a phone before reaching for each other. And I met Henry 4 years earlier during a delayed train ride to Manchester after a storm shut down half the railway system. Everyone around us looked miserable. A man near the platform kept complaining loudly to staff members who clearly could not control the weather. My shoes were wet, my phone battery was almost dead. And I remember sitting there thinking I would miss an important client meeting the next morning. Henry sat across from me reading a novel like none of the chaos mattered. At one point, he noticed me staring at the broken coffee machine near the waiting area and offered me the second sandwich from his bag. He did it casually, already returning to his book before I even answered. That was the first thing I liked about him. Nothing about Henry performed for attention. During the train ride, we talked for nearly 2 hours. And not the usual first conversation topics either. We talked about burnout before people started calling it burnout, about jobs that slowly turned personalities into performances, about cities that made people feel lonely, even while surrounded by millions of others. I remember thinking Henry listened in a way that made lying feel unnecessary. At 27, that felt rare enough to fall in love with. The first year together felt easy in the best possible way. We cooked late dinners in my tiny apartment while music played quietly in the background. Sometimes Henry read random paragraphs from books aloud, while I answered work emails beside him. Other nights, we walked through the city with no plans at all. Ordinary life felt softer around him. Then my promotion happened. At first, I loved everything about it. More money, bigger projects, better clients. My company suddenly treated me like someone important, and I became addicted to that feeling faster than I realized. The office changed me slowly. Everyone there wore exhaustion proudly, like proof they mattered more than other people. Coworkers answered emails during birthdays, anniversaries, funerals. One woman took a conference call from a hospital waiting room while her husband sat beside her holding flowers she barely looked at. Back then, I quietly judged people like that. 6 months later, I had become one of them. Henry noticed before I did. He started staying awake for me at night, even when he had work early the next morning. Sometimes I came home to candles on the table and food already prepared. Other nights he planned small weekend trips outside London because he said I looked tired lately. I usually refused. At first he hid the disappointment badly. Then eventually he stopped trying to hide it at all. One Friday night I came home after another office event and found him asleep on the sofa beside cold pasta and 2 untouched wine glasses. The television still flickered silently across the room. I remember standing there with my heels hanging from one hand, feeling almost angry at him for still trying so hard. Not guilty, angry, like his effort was exposing something ugly inside me that I did not want to examine too closely. I walked into the kitchen to get water before going to bed, and noticed he had kept my dinner plate inside the oven so it would stay warm. The oven light was still on. He must have reheated the food more than once while waiting for me to come home. For a few seconds, I stood there staring at the plate while the apartment stayed completely quiet around me. Then my phone buzzed with another work email, and I answered it before the guilt could fully settle in. Before I share the rest of story, I need to know, where are you listening from? I would love to hear from you. The next evening, Henry asked if we could eat dinner together without phones nearby. He said it while chopping vegetables at the kitchen counter, not looking directly at me. Rain tapped softly against the windows behind him, and the apartment smelled faintly of garlic and butter. Normally, that smell relaxed me. That night, it made me feel cornered. Sure, I answered too quickly. I left my phone on the kitchen shelf instead of beside my plate. Henry noticed immediately, and I could tell from the small pause in his movements before he sat across from me. For the first few minutes, we spoke carefully about ordinary things. A rude customer at the bookstore, a delayed meeting at my office, the neighbor upstairs who vacuumed after midnight almost every night. Then conversation thinned out, not awkward at first, just fragile. Henry kept moving his fork around the plate without eating much. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I could not read properly anymore. "Do you still enjoy being here?" he asked. I looked around the apartment automatically before realizing what he meant. "With me," he clarified quietly. The question should not have surprised me. Looking back, it had probably been waiting between us for months. Still, hearing it aloud made my chest tighten immediately. Why would you ask that?" Henry let out a tired breath and rested both hands against the table. "Because every time life becomes quiet for 5 minutes, you leave the room emotionally." The sentence hit harder than shouting would have. Outside, tires hissed across wet streets below the apartment building. Henry looked exhausted in a way sleep could not fix. I suddenly realized how long he must have been carrying this alone, while I kept pretending work explained everything. For months I had blamed stress for the distance growing between us. Stress, pressure, deadlines. But sitting there across from him, I understood something uglier. Work had not stolen my attention accidentally. I had started giving more emotional energy to the version of myself that existed outside our marriage, because that version felt more exciting. At work, I sounded confident. At home, I felt exposed. "I don't know what happened to me lately," I admitted quietly. Henry looked down at his plate for a second before answering, "That's the problem, Michelle. It stopped being lately a long time ago." Neither of us spoke much after that. Later that night, Henry fell asleep facing the opposite side of the bed, while I stared at shadows moving slowly across the ceiling. His breathing sounded distant even though our bodies were inches apart. I remember thinking that loneliness inside a relationship felt different from ordinary loneliness, sharper somehow, like being locked outside your own home emotionally. The weeks after that dinner became quieter between us, not hostile, worse, careful. Henry stopped asking when I would come home from work. He stopped planning dinners out or suggesting weekend trips. The little efforts that once filled our apartment disappeared so gradually, I barely noticed at first. Until one Tuesday evening when I came home early and realized the apartment no longer felt alive without them. Henry had fallen asleep at the kitchen table beside a pile of bookstore paperwork. Receipts and invoices covered half the surface. A calculator rested near one hand, and beside his coffee mug sat our wedding photo inside a silver frame. I stood there looking at it longer than I should have. In the picture, Henry looked completely certain about us. One hand rested against my waist while I laughed at something outside the camera frame. We looked connected in the effortless way happy couples usually do before they realize love also requires maintenance. Yeah, the worst part was understanding Henry probably still looked at me that way, long after I stopped looking at him similarly. The next morning I tried making conversation during breakfast. It felt unnatural immediately. Henry answered politely, but with the caution people use around injured animals. Every sentence sounded measured, like he no longer trusted warmth to be safe between us. That distance followed me into work. James noticed it almost instantly. "You look exhausted," he said, while walking beside me after a meeting. "You need a weekend away from your real life." At first, the comment sounded harmless. Then something about it stayed under my skin. Your real life. As if marriage had become some temporary inconvenience standing between me and a better version of myself. That evening, several coworkers invited me out again after work. Normally, I would have gone automatically. Instead, I stayed behind pretending to answer emails while everyone else disappeared toward elevators and expensive bars. The office became strangely empty after hours. Without movement and noise, everything looked artificial. Glass walls, white lights, half-dead plants near reception, rows of expensive chairs nobody ever sat in comfortably. For the first time in months, I saw the place clearly. Everyone there looked successful. Nobody there looked rested. I thought about Henry eating dinner alone again while strangers congratulated each other for being too busy to enjoy their own lives. Then I remembered the photo he had sent days earlier. Cold dinner plates waiting on the kitchen table. Something inside me shifted slightly that night, not dramatically, just enough to make the emptiness harder to ignore. When I got home, Henry sat on the sofa reading beside a single lamp. The apartment looked warm against the rain outside. He glanced up when I entered, surprised enough that I realized how unusual it had become for me to return home before 10. For a moment, I almost crossed the room to tell him everything honestly. That I missed him. That I missed who I used to be before ambition started eating every softer part of my personality. Instead, I asked if he had eaten already. And the disappointment crossed his face so quickly he probably thought I missed it. I didn't. And for the first time, guilt stayed with me after the moment passed instead of disappearing beneath distractions. A few days later, Henry mentioned visiting his brother in Liverpool for the weekend. He asked if I wanted to come, though his tone sounded careful, almost detached, as if he had already prepared himself for rejection. Normally, I would have said no without thinking, but something about the distance between us had finally started frightening me more than inconvenience did, so I said yes. The drive to Liverpool lasted nearly 4 hours because of traffic and rain. At first, conversation felt awkward, but slowly things softened. Old songs played quietly through the speakers while the city disappeared behind gray highways and wet fields. At one point, Henry laughed at a ridiculous radio advertisement, and hearing that laugh again affected me more than I expected. I realized I had spent months surrounding myself with loud people, while forgetting how comforting gentleness sounded. His brother's house sat near the water outside the city. It was crowded, noisy, imperfect. Children ran through hallways while everyone argued over board games and burned garlic bread. Nothing about the evening looked impressive. Still, people there seemed genuinely happy in a way my coworkers never did. I watched Henry differently that night. Around his family, he looked lighter, more open, more like the man I met on that delayed train years earlier. And sometime during dinner, while watching him help his niece clean juice from the floor without irritation, I understood something painful. Henry had not emotionally left our marriage first. I had. That weekend in Liverpool stayed with me after we returned to London, not because something dramatic happened there. Nothing did. Henry's nieces fought over television channels, his brother burned breakfast on Sunday morning, and rain hit the windows almost the entire time we stayed. But somewhere inside all that ordinary noise, I noticed how different Henry became when he felt emotionally safe. He laughed more easily. He spoke without stopping to think first. At one point, he passed behind me in the kitchen and touched my shoulder absent-mindedly, before quickly pulling his hand back, like he suddenly remembered things between us were no longer simple. That small movement hurt more than any argument we had ever had. On the drive home, traffic slowed near Birmingham because of an accident ahead. Cars barely moved for almost 40 minutes. Henry rested one hand loosely against the steering wheel while soft music played through the speakers. I kept watching him without meaning to. There was nothing dramatic about Henry. No polished charm like James carried around the office. No need to dominate conversations or impress strangers. Henry simply made people feel comfortable enough to become themselves around him. I suddenly wondered how many times I had mistaken emotional steadiness for boredom. That thought followed me into work the next week. Everything there started looking different once I stopped admiring it blindly. Meetings that once felt important now sounded repetitive. Coworkers interrupted one another constantly just to appear smarter. People spoke about burnout proudly, like exhaustion itself had become a personality trait. Even James began feeling rehearsed to me. One afternoon, he stopped beside my desk and asked whether I was joining everyone for drinks later that evening. For a second, the old instinct returned automatically. Say yes. Stay visible. Stay included. Then I pictured Henry sitting alone at the kitchen table again, pretending not to look at the clock every few minutes. "No," I said quietly. "I'm going home tonight." James looked surprised before smiling carelessly. "You've changed lately." The strange part was that he sounded disappointed, not because he missed me personally, but because I no longer fit naturally into that world with him anymore. That realization clarified something uncomfortable. James had never wanted closeness from me. He enjoyed admiration, attention, movement. If I disappeared tomorrow, someone else would eventually sit beside him at another rooftop bar while he repeated the same stories over expensive drinks. But Henry had spent months waiting for me emotionally while I slowly disappeared from our marriage right in front of him. There was a difference between being admired and being genuinely known. One disappeared when attention moved elsewhere. The other stayed. That evening, I came home carrying groceries instead of takeaway coffee and office stress. Henry looked genuinely confused when I walked into the kitchen and started unpacking vegetables beside him. "You finished work early?" he asked carefully. "Yeah." Even saying the sentence aloud felt unfamiliar. For months, my entire life had revolved around proving I was indispensable at work. I answered emails during dinners, during weekends, sometimes even half awake in bed at 2 a.m. Somewhere along the way, I had started treating constant availability like proof I mattered. Now the apartment felt strangely peaceful without my phone vibrating every few minutes. Dinner that evening felt awkward at first, not cold, just uncertain, like two people trying to relearn a language they once spoke naturally. Henry still watched me carefully sometimes, as though he expected distance to return without warning. I understood why. Trust does not repair itself immediately after emotional neglect. People become cautious around pain once they learn how quietly it can enter a relationship. Later that night, Henry sat reading on the sofa while I answered a few final emails nearby. Around 11, And I closed my laptop and noticed him watching me over the top of his book. "You stop checking your phone every 30 seconds, he said. I smiled faintly. "I'm trying." Henry lowered the book slowly onto his lap. "I know." 3 simple words. But hearing appreciation in his voice instead of disappointment almost broke something inside me. A few weeks later, I came home from work and found Henry asleep on the sofa again. One arm hung loosely toward the floor, while rain moved softly against the windows behind him. A book rested open on his chest. Months earlier, scenes like this used to irritate me. I saw his routines as proof that life beside him lacked excitement. Now they looked peaceful, in a way my own life hadn't felt for a long time. I covered him with the blanket that had slipped onto the floor, and Henry woke slightly during the movement. His eyes opened halfway, before settling on me with sleepy confusion. "You're home early," he said softly. "Yeah." He studied my face quietly for a second. Not suspicious exactly. Careful, like part of him still worried this version of me might disappear again. Without thinking too much, I sat beside him and rested my head lightly against his shoulder. Henry stayed still at first. Then slowly, carefully, he leaned his head against mine. No dramatic speech followed after that moment, no perfect apology capable of fixing everything instantly. Real relationships rarely heal through one beautiful conversation. Most of the time, they heal through repetition, through small choices made consistently after long periods of neglect, making dinner together again, putting phones away. Coming home before exhaustion turned both people into strangers. I used to think love disappeared suddenly. Now I think it disappears quietly beneath distractions people mistake for more important things: work, ego, attention, the constant need to feel impressive. The dangerous part is that emotional neglect rarely looks dramatic while it is happening. From the outside, our marriage probably looks stable the entire time. No cheating, no screaming fights, just 2 people sitting beside each other while one of them slowly stopped showing up emotionally. I almost let that become permanent. Today, I still work at the same company, and Henry still spends his days inside that small bookstore near our apartment. Some evenings, when my phone lights up during dinner, I still feel the old instinct to reach for it immediately. And sometimes I catch Henry glancing toward the screen for half a second before looking away again. Those small scars never disappear completely. But now, when that happens, I turn the phone face down and stay where I am. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional English stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever realized someone's love only after you started losing them?